Hey you guys, and welcome back to the salon. So, when we last discussed the Boris Karloff hosted series Thriller, we had actually finished up all 37 episodes of season 1. So, now it's time to just plunge right into the second and unfortunately final season of Thriller. So, here we go. So, the first episode of the second season is called What Beckoning Ghost? And I have to say, this first episode, it's a little bit of a letdown from, the excellent installment, which is called The Grim Reaper, which was, the wrap up of season 1. But this is a pretty solid story. It's a little bit generic, I will say that. It's kind of another story about a bunch of grasping shitheels trying to bump off a rich relative with some, really convoluted scheme to cash in on their wealth, you know what I mean? But I will say that at least this one has the benefit of actually having a supernatural angle to it, probably. I mean, yeah. So that's kind of a definite point in its favor. So this was directed by the great Ida Lupino, who did a bunch of these, and it was adapted by Donald S. Sanford from another short story by Harold Lawler, who a lot of his short stories were adapted for this series. So the plot of this one revolves around kind of like this previously famous, very wealthy concert pianist whose name is Mildred Beaumont. Now, actually, she's been in loads of things, but I actually immediately recognized her from The Tingler with Vincent Price, that old William Castle movie. So there's that. So apparently Mildred has had some health issues and has been kind of largely confined to bed, I guess. Her mental and physical state is implied to be a little bit delicate, I guess. So at the beginning of the story, though, it does seem that she's kind of on her way to getting better. She's kind of on the mend, you know what I mean? She's just returned from this supposedly fabulous night out, which is again implied to be the first in a long time, with her seemingly awesome and adoring husband, Eric, who's played by Tom Helmore, who was in Vertigo and The Time Machine and a bunch of other things. So Eric doesn't actually want her to get too overtired, and he tries to persuade her to just go on to bed. But Mildred is so happy, and she's still riding a high from being out on the town or whatever. So she wants to kind of stay up and have some champagne in front of the fireplace like they used to do back in the old days when she was still, healthy. So Eric decides he's gonna indulge her, and he goes to get the fire going. And then Mildred just toddled off down to get the champagne or whatever. On her way there, though, she peers into the living room or drawing room or parlor or whatever. I don't even know what the difference between those things is, but regardless. So she looks in there and she just recoils in horror, right? Because right in front of the window in this living room is a coffin and a funeral wreath on it that basically says, "To my dear wife, rest in peace," except in Latin. And I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that. But it says it in Latin. So there's even kind of this really sad organ music coming from somewhere. Mildred freaks out, as you would, and kind of clutches her chest. It was kind of earlier implied, I guess, that she had a weak heart, and she collapses to the floor. So the next morning, she wakes up in her room, and Eric seems very concerned. He's kind of attending her. Also living in the mansion, by the way, is Mildred's younger, hotter sister, who's played by Lydia, or the name of her character is Lydia. She's actually played by Adele Mara, I think is her last name, who was in Sands of Iwo Jima, and a bunch of other things. So the sister, I guess it's, again, implied that she moved in to help take care of Mildred, when her health started declining. So Eric and Lydia, they kind of seem to have something of a contentious relationship. They can't really agree on what would be best for Mildred, but they tell her that the doctor came to see her last night. But they said, well, it wasn't your regular doctor, and I can't remember what his name was. They said, but he was out of town, so they sent this other guy named Dr. Bertoli. Now, Mildred is very troubled by this news because she actually does not remember the doctor coming there at all, even though she does remember the coffin and the, funeral wreath and everything like that with just, perfect crystal clarity, right? Eric and Lydia tell her that, oh, she's gonna be totally fine. It's she probably just overexerted herself. It was the first night out in a long time. She just got overexcited, and she just had a little bit of a hallucination. That's all. It's no big deal. Just take these sedatives that this nice new doctor prescribed, and you'll be right as rain in no time. It's all good. Now, and I know that something very, very sketchy is going on with Eric and Lydia. And because they're portrayed as disliking each other, you also know that they're probably having an affair, because that's kind of like the oldest trope in the book, right? Like when you see it in this kind of thing. So, and I'm going to say that one of my main criticisms of the episode, while I'm on the subject, is its kind of predictability. In spite of Boris Karloff, like in the hosting role, telling us in the intro that we shouldn't think we have the whole story figured out because it's going to surprise us, the plot doesn't actually surprise us. It actually unspools pretty much the way you expect it to, supposed ghost and all. So there's that. So the doctor, allegedly, comes for a follow-up visit, like the next afternoon. But apparently Mildred took some of the sedatives in the morning and slept all the way through till dinner time, like she didn't mean to. But again, she says she does not remember the doctor coming there, even though Eric says, oh, well, you were awake and you were talking to him the whole time. Now, at this point, she starts to get a little bit suspicious, as you would. But then the phone rings and supposedly it's the doctor, like on the other end of the line. So Eric takes the call, like out on the hall extension, and Mildred kind of sneakily, surreptitiously, like picks up the phone like next to her bed, like to listen into what they're talking about. Now she's very relieved to hear Eric talking to someone who indeed sounds like a doctor. So she kind of like starts beating herself up. It's like, oh, I shouldn't have mistrusted my wonderful husband, blah-de-blah. So the doctor apparently tells Eric that Mildred might have to be institutionalized if she keeps having these memory lapses. So Mildred overhears this and she's like, oh shit, well, I'm going to, even if I don't, I'm going to pretend that I remember everything that happened, like from now on. Oh yeah, I totally remember that. You know what I mean? Because she doesn't want to get institutionalized, obviously. Eric also, when he comes back in, he basically tells her, well, even if you do see some crazy shit, at least you know now, like intellectually, that it's a hallucination, and you just repeat to yourself that until it goes away. Like, you'll be able to get a handle on it now that you know it's not real. Now, as if we weren't already looking a little bit sideways at this whole entire situation, Eric goes away for a week on a business trip. And while he's gone, Lydia, her sister, sits down for kind of like a serious talk with her. So it turns out that Mildred is the one with all the money. Like, she was the one that was a celebrity, and Eric was actually originally her manager. So she's the one that always signs the checks, and this is apparently the way that her and Eric have always operated, like as long as they've been married. Lydia, though, insinuates to her sister that this setup is probably really emasculating for Eric. And she suggests, maybe, Mildred, you should put, kind of a portion of your wealth into an account for him so he doesn't feel like he always has to come to you for money. You know what I mean? Like a teenage kid begging for an allowance or something like that. Now, Mildred admits she never really thought about it this way because Eric never complained, but she does actually seem really kind of thoughtful and maybe like receptive to this. Oh, maybe you're right. You know what I mean? And at this point, I'm watching it and I'm like, damn, Lydia, it's like, could you be any more obviously shady, and could Mildred be any more just unreasonably trusting? It's really kind of like a sad story. So when Eric comes back from his trip, it's made very clear, as if we hadn't already figured this out, that him and Lydia have been playing, hide the sausage behind Mildred's back, right? Because they like smooch the hell out of each other on the staircase. They're not even trying to hide it, Shortly after this, Mildred surprises Eric with the announcement that she hasn't just set up an account for him with half her money or whatever. Oh no. She has actually gone whole fucking hog with it and given him complete access to all her money, like whenever he wants it, no restrictions, no caveats. He can just write a check and go down there and cash it and everything's coming up roses, you know what I mean? And I'm sitting there like, not to victim blame or anything like that, but like, does this poor woman have like sucker invisibly tattooed across her forehead or what? Because I can't believe she fell for that bullshit. In a startling twist, however, Eric actually refuses this generous offer and tears up the paperwork and ostensibly calls the family lawyer to call off this whole agreement. Now, Mildred is initially kind of shocked and a little bit like offended by this, like, oh, you don't want it or whatever. But then she kind of like thinks about it and she's sort of like heartened, comforted by the fact that, oh, Eric really does love me and he's not just like after me for my money. But again, you know, and I know, that this is all a very calculated move to throw Mildred off the scent of what these two are up to, and she totally, sadly, falls for it. So even though Mildred seems to have been feeling much better lately, she still gets awakened in the middle of the night by another one of her purported hallucinations, let's call it that. So she starts hearing the funeral organ music again, and she's kind of like, filled with dread, and she creeps down to the drawing room or living room or whatever, like to see what's up. Now, to no one's surprise, The coffin and that ominous funeral wreath have returned. But this time, Mildred tries to use like Eric's advice by kind of like approaching the whole tableau, telling herself over and over, it's not real, it's not real, it's not real. But every time she opens and closes her eyes, though, all of the shit is still there, and, you know, gotta admit, it's looking pretty fucking real at this point. Worst part, though, is that when she approaches the coffin, she sees that it's open, and her own dead body appears to be lying in there. Well, this whole situation is just finally too much for Mildred's poor weak heart, and she just drops dead in a heap on the floor. Moments after that, Eric comes into the room and basically just, this is so fucked up, and he just like kicks her corpse over on its back. Like, that's right, you know what I mean? And I was just like, damn, that is like ice cold. So he's like checking to make sure like the old bat really has fucking died, right? Now, it's then revealed, of course, that the coffin and the wreath were, absolutely real. And that the body in the casket was actually Lydia wearing an extremely realistic Mildred mask, which I was like sitting there thinking, it's like, man, they must have got this from the same manufacturer that the Mission Impossible people source from, because goddamn, that was a really good mask. So it's then explained through kind of like conversation and visual cues and stuff like that, that number one, the mask was made from like a bust of Mildred that she'd had sculpted like several years before, I guess, when she was really famous. Number two, there never was a Dr. Bertoli, like this other doctor that they sent, and Eric had actually engineered that whole phone call between him and the doctor with a recording of his own disguised voice that he was like interacting with over the phone. Number three, obviously, Eric never called the lawyer or tore up the agreement saying that he got all of Mildred's money. So now he got all Mildred's money. So he's like a very wealthy person. It also transpires that Lydia, who is just, again, like a cold-hearted motherfucker, she engineered this whole entire plot. Like, this was her idea, and she is just really smug about how awesome it turned out. Naturally, though, because this is a TV show from the 1960s and bad guys weren't allowed to get away with anything, so we know that these two miscreants are not going to get away with these dastardly deeds that they've been doing. So not too long after Mildred's death, a sympathy card shows up at the house with a bunch of other ones. Only this one is offering condolences not for Mildred's death, but for Eric's death. Now, Lydia thinks this is fucking hilarious. She figures that somebody just misread the obituary or something like that. But Eric is a little bit unsettled and a little bit pissed off about this, believing that somebody, perhaps even Lydia, is playing kind of like a morbid prank on him, right? This perception is not helped by the piano music that he also hears like echoing throughout the house that night, and by the mysterious arrival of another one of those funeral wreaths, except this one says, "To my dear husband," like rest in peace. So again, he thinks this is like a really sick joke, but in the envelope that's attached to the wreath, he finds a wedding ring that he's sure is Mildred's. Now, Lydia says that's gotta be just like a copy, but Eric is starting to think that either his wife faked her death and is now fucking with him, like to get revenge, or is actually dead and is taking revenge from beyond the grave, you know what I mean? So all of this stress like starts causing Eric to hit the bottle hard, well, harder than usual. And that obviously is not helping his mental state much at all. So because he still thinks somebody's playing a trick on him, but he kind of low-key thinks maybe this is maybe a haunting too. So he actually goes to the cemetery, like I guess to check and see if like a zombified Mildred like crawled out of the crypt or some shit like that, or to see what else is going on. So he goes there, but finds to his distress that not only is her portion of the crypt like completely intact, like nobody busted into it, that's because she was buried with the ring, you know what I mean? So they're like, well, somebody may have broken there and got it if they were going to play a trick, but no, there was nothing wrong with the crypt. Not only that, but the lower portion of the crypt that they had bought the couple crypt like ahead of time. So the bottom crypt already had like his name on it, but didn't have the dates filled in yet. Well, now the date is filled in, and the date of his death is tomorrow. Now, he's still pretty sure he's not believing in ghosts, though. And he basically accuses Lydia of pulling the same shit on him that she pulled on her sister. Because like I said, this whole plot was like Lydia's idea, even though he went along with it, obviously. Now she insists to him, it's like, look, it's not me. It's like, how would I even inscribe the crypt? And what about all that piano music? Like, I can't play piano for shit. Like, she's like, I can't even play chopsticks, like, much less all of Mildred's, like, compositions, you know what I mean? But, you know, Eric is still kind of giving her the side eye. He can't think of anybody else that would have a reason to do this to him. And he's basically like, look, bitch, it's like, if you think that you're gonna frighten me into a heart attack like you did to poor old Mildred, then you have another fucking thing coming. However, later that night, a drunk-ass Eric is woke up by that spooky piano music again in the house. And he kind of like staggers down the hall toward the stairs. Now Lydia comes out her room and she's trying to stop him, saying that, you know, there's no music, she doesn't hear anything, but he like whacks her upside the head with a whiskey bottle. Like, it's kind of off screen, but it's like so loud. I was like, holy shit. It was because he was like, wham, and I was just like, holy fucking shit. And like it breaks and everything. Like, I'm like, god damn, did he just fucking kill her? Yeah. So I was not expecting that. And that actually like knocks her out for a bit. So then he goes down to the drawing room, living room thing, and sees, you know, again, you'll probably not be surprised that he sees his own coffin and funeral wreath, and the piano next to it is actually playing all by itself. So at this point, he's like full on convinced that this is like paranormal now, right? So he starts like fucking wigging out. Lydia actually recovers and runs down there to help him. And she's like, dude, you are seeing things. There's no coffin there. There's no music. There's no wreath. There's no nothing. But then like before she gets into the drawing room, like the drawing room doors like close and lock on their own. So she's kind of like left outside in the hall and she's kind of like helplessly like pounding on the door like to get let in, but it's locked. Subsequently, Eric appears to be hefted out of the drawing room window by someone to his death down on the concrete below. So the cops show up, and because Lydia has like a torn sleeve and smells like booze, because obviously of the bottle that Eric broke over her fucking head, the officers assume that her and Eric got into a fight and that she ended up pushing his ass out the window. Now she tries to tell them what really happened, but of course they don't really believe her, and I guess their like assessment of her mental stability is not real good, because she starts suddenly insisting too that she also sees the piano playing by itself, like the keys going up and down. So she gets hauled away for murder, or I guess it would be manslaughter. Like if you were having a fight and pushed somebody out a window, I guess that'd be manslaughter. And then while they're pulling her away, she's just ranting and raving about Mildred's ghost, like coming back for revenge. And they're just like, whatever, come tell it to the judge or whatever. So it's pretty clearly implied in the story that Mildred's spirit is real and did all this shit. Although I guess there could be some like plausible deniability, because the cops don't see the coffin or the wreath and they don't hear the music, which leaves open the possibility that Eric and Lydia's guilt was maybe making them see and hear things that weren't there, like maybe like the, you know, the telltale heart or something like that. On the other hand, they apparently did not imagine that funeral wreath and the wedding ring that showed up in the foyer or whatever. Although to be fair, they were the only ones who saw it. So, I don't know. I found myself kind of amused by the idea of, like, a ghost calling up a funeral home and, like, requesting the wreath be sent to the house. And it's like, what the fuck did Mildred pay for the wreath with? Like, you know what I mean? Like, she have, like, an American Express Afterlife account or some shit like that. Yeah, I'm a ghost. Can you, like, send this over to this? I don't know. That was, like, that's the kind of shit that I think about when I'm watching these. And, like, by the same token, now that I'm thinking about it, wouldn't the authorities have been suspicious about Mildred's death, like, from the jump? Because presumably Eric and Lydia had to order a coffin and a funeral wreath from somewhere, like, prior to her dying, right? Because they were trying to, like, scare her to death, essentially. I mean, you can't just, like, buy that stuff, have your wife die a few days later, and then not expect to have some people, like, raising some eyebrows at you. You know what I mean? So, like I said, this was a pretty good episode. I mean, solidly middle of the pack, I think, of, like, all the thriller episodes. It's not super, super original, and it was pretty obvious where it was gonna go, like, despite Boris like promising twists and turns and stuff, but it was still like entertaining enough. And I think like the acting and the camera work here were really a highlight. Usually the episodes that Ida Lupino directed had really interesting camera work. I think she was kind of like the best one in that regard, like as a visual stylist. So the second episode is called Guillotine or Guillotine. And it was also directed by Ida Lupino. This was also decent and had some really great suspense. I have to admit I was somewhat familiar with the source story, which was written by Cornell Woolrich. So I already knew like roughly the direction it was going to go, but that didn't really like spoil my enjoyment of it. So the story is set in 1875, and it follows a condemned prisoner named Robert Lamont, and he has an upcoming execution date. Now, like all the other prisoners, he's not actually sure like when his number is going to come up because they keep it secret, I guess. So at the beginning, like his cellmate gets carted off, like screaming his head off at the beginning of the story. So he knows, well, I must be coming up next or my time is coming soon. Now, shortly after this, he's visited by his wife, Babette, who actually like bribed some of the guards to like let her in to see him. Now, it turns out that the reason that Robert is in this predicament in the first place is because he caught Babette with another man and killed the guy. Now, Babette testified against her husband, like at the ensuing trial, right? Now, Babette seems contrite, like she seems to feel bad about it, which I guess you would. And Robert seems to forgive her, like saying, oh, I know that you were forced to testify, blah, blah, blah. But he's obviously still pretty bitter about the whole thing because he keeps bringing it up, like in a really passive-aggressive kind of way. However, he tells her that maybe there is a way that she can redeem herself. There's something of an unwritten law or tradition or something like that. If the executioner dies on the day of a particular prisoner's execution, that prisoner is set free. Now, this seems like a really weird rule that is just ripe for abuse, as this story will demonstrate. But, you know, I was like, okay, 19th century France, like just do whatever you want to do. So Robert tells Babette, you got to do two things. First, you have to find out what the date of my execution is, because that's a very closely guarded secret, I guess. Second, you have to kill the executioner on the appointed day, so he won't be around to, like, you know, pull the lever that's going to separate Robert's body from, you know, that real important top bit there. Now, Babette is kind of like, I got to straight up murder a dude. I'm not really sure if I'm comfortable with that. You know what I mean? But, I mean, she did say that she would do anything to help Robert because she feels so guilty about him being in there. So, you know, she sort of walked into that one. However, she doesn't give him a definitive answer about whether she's going to do it, like before she leaves the cell, though. But soon after, it becomes pretty clear that Babette has committed herself to this very dubious plot. So she puts on, like, kind of a pretty dress and brushes her hair all pretty and everything. And she carries this basket of very pretty, like, brightly colored, well, they say they're brightly colored, but it's black and white, so you know what I mean. You have to use your imagination. But there's carnations, so she has a basket of those. And she goes to this cafe that the executioner, whose name is Monsieur de Paris, or Perry or whatever, is kind of known to go to. Now, I don't think this is mentioned. I didn't hear this mentioned in the story outright, but I'm assuming that Babette must have gotten, like, some scuttlebutt from somewhere, like, about the executioner's interest in gardening to take this particular tack in getting to know him, because how would she know that otherwise? But I don't think that was in the story, but you're just like led to assume that. So she kind of like approaches him with her basket of flowers, and he just like starts rhapsodizing how beautiful these flowers are. And she says, oh, I grow them myself, and, you know, if you, you're welcome to have some cuttings, like, if you want some for your own garden. So he's just, like, super excited about this. And Babette is just, like, playing her part to the hilt. She's, like, very sweet. She's very interested. She's a little bit, like, subtly flirtatious. Like, the executioner guy is old enough to be her dad, really, but he's kind of like a single guy. He's lonely, and, you know, mainly because his profession, he's the executioner. So, you know, a lot of people in the village aren't super jazzed to like hang out with him or anything like that. So he kind of like appreciates any attention, especially from a beautiful young woman who seems interested in what he has to say. So Babette starts kind of cultivating a friendship with the executioner and ends up wangling a dinner invitation to his house. Now, prior to this, we've actually seen her testing like a poison powder on a bug or something. So we pretty much know exactly why she wants to get in such close proximity to this dude's food, right? Now, a wrinkle in the plan when she shows up at the house appears in the form of the executioner's very overbearing housekeeper, who seems more like his mom. Her name is Madame Leclerc. And she eats at the table with them and is very, very rude to Babette and very suspicious of her intentions. I mean, rightly so, obviously, but she thinks that Babette is after her employer's money, which he doesn't actually have a lot of. He's just an executioner. He's not like a fucking millionaire or nothing. But she doesn't suspect that Babette is actually trying to kill him. But Babette like protests and says she's like, no, I'm not after him for that or anything like that. And she's able to convince Madame Leclerc. Like, Madame Leclerc kind of like softens toward her a little bit. But because the housekeeper is just like looming and she's like around, so Babette is not able to get out from under her scrutiny long enough to like sprinkle the poison into the food at the dinner table. But she's kind of resourceful, so she pivots. And she's like, okay, hey, Madame Leclerc, how about you teach me how to make these kind of like apple pancake things that that the executioner like asked for breakfast the next morning. It's like, oh, I've always wanted to know how to make those, and I'm kind of hopeless in the kitchen and blah blah. So she's like, I want you to show me how to make those. So while they go in the kitchen and the housekeeper has her back turned, like getting paper and pencil to like write the recipe down for her, Babette ends up putting like this poison into the pancake filling, you know what I mean, like the apples and everything. So after that, like she leaves the house and then she goes and she writes a note to Robert, like her husband, in his prison cell and says, oh, you know, I did it. Like I pulled it off. And I was like, that's a little presumptuous, I'm going to say. Like personally, I think if I was going to, if I was doing this plot, I think I would have waited until the guy was, you know, certifiably dead before I would went and like popped off like that. But, you know, whatever, different strokes. Now, Robert, equally unwisely, is so certain that the girl came through for him that he starts acting like smug as fuck to his jailers. He's betting them like huge amounts of money that the execution isn't going to happen, and he's just like, oh, it's fine, I'm not scared, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, I was like, okay, so since he already asked one of the jailers earlier about the whole headsman dying on the day of the execution rule, it's like, oh, is that a real rule? Does that really work out like that? I mean, so this seems like a really stupid flex is what I'm saying. If it was me, I think I would have kept all of that cockiness like really on the down low to kind of keep the authorities from getting suspicious, but you know, what do I know? Now, it so happens that in spite of what you may be thinking, Babette's plan did actually work, but only up to a point. Now, the executioner did eat the poison pancakes and does start to feel really, really ill while he's getting ready to set out for the prison to do the execution. Unfortunately, the poison was apparently not as fast acting as Babette might have liked, because although the executioner clearly feels like total ass, he's bound and determined to get to that guillotine and slice Robert's fucking head off. So after that, there's this really, really tense sequence which kind of alternates between Robert being like a cocky asshole, you know, to his jailers, and the kind of steadily sickening executioner like trying to get to the prison, and he's just getting sicker and sicker and stumbling and shit like that. And I mean, this was like the best part of the whole episode, because even though you were pretty sure how it was going to turn out, like it was going to be kind of like a little bit of a gotcha ending or something like that, it still really kept you on the edge of your seat, like going back and forth like that. So the jailers are starting to wonder what the hell is going on. Like they might be losing this bet, right? You know what I mean? Because the executioner is always punctual. He's like very conscientious about his job, which is kind of fucked up, but okay. And they're just kind of at a loss what to do in this unprecedented situation. They're like, we've never known him to be late. Now, Robert, again, being kind of like an overconfident douche and demonstrating that he's maybe not the sharpest baguette in the bread box, he tells them, hey, just for shits and giggles, why don't you tie my hands behind my back and march me out to the guillotine? I want to get the full experience. You know, and I'm like, are you fucking kidding me right now? I mean, he still thinks he's going to skate, so you know, how often do you get the opportunity to like pretend like you're on the cusp of your own execution? You know what I mean? Must be the thrill of a lifetime. So he's just like, yeah, we're going to go through the whole, I want the whole, all the bells and whistles. You know what I mean? It's like, I was like, okay, dude. So you could probably guess what happens, even if you haven't read the original Cornell Woolrich story. So the executioner shows up at the prison, but he's in bad shape. And by the time he gets to the guillotine, like he can hardly walk. Now, Robert, by this point, he's getting a little bit fucking nervous, right? He gets put into the guillotine, and as he starts to realize that the executioner might actually make it to the lever after all, he starts to, again, like scream his bloody head off, you know, pun very much intended. Now, as fate would have it, the executioner takes his last breath, like right before he's gonna pull the lever. And Robert, just in total triumph, he just like shrieks whatever the 19th century France equivalent of suck it, you know what I mean? It's basically that. But then, in a shocking or not so shocking twist, the guy who's checking the executioner for a pulse, like sort of accidentally, like drops the dead dude's hand onto the lever, and then Robert's head goes swishing into the basket, and you're just like, what? Justice served. So as I said, this was another really solid episode. I mean, no surprises really, but the suspense was really, really well done, and the acting was really decent too. Some of the French accents were better than others, but none were like distracting or anything like that. I will note that the actress that played Babette was actually French. The guy who played Robert was Argentinian, I think, and he sounded totally legit. The guy that played the executioner was an American, but he did okay. It sounded fine. But yeah, so this was another very enjoyable, but, kind of middle of the road sort of episode. So the third episode, the Premature Burial. Now, you might think that this episode would also be somewhat predictable, given how familiar the original story by Edgar Allan Poe obviously is to most people. But the screenwriter, Douglas Hayes, who also directed it, actually kind of did something different with this adaptation. He used like some minor aspects of the source story and fleshed it out in directions that you might not expect. Like, he kind of really built it out to quite a degree. Not all of it works, at least in my opinion, but it's still, again, like another solid episode. This is also another always welcome installment where Boris Karloff gets to act in the story rather than just host it. And that's like always a treat because, obviously I love Boris Karloff. So at the beginning, there's a 50-year-old man named Edward Stapleton, and he has died suddenly. And at his funeral, his friend and also his doctor, his name is Dr. Thorne, who's played by Boris Karloff, he's just really sad that he was out of town when this happened. And then he tells the attending physician, who's Dr. March, that he's like, look, I have every faith in your diagnosis. I know there wasn't anything you could have done, but I still want to figure out what happened to Edward. Like, the man was healthy as a horse, and I can't really figure out why he would have just dropped dead like that. Now, he vows, look, if I have to break into the crypt to, like, steal this fucking body because the family doesn't want him, disinterred, he's like, I'm going to do that. I mean, even if it runs afoul of a law or two, you know what I mean? But Boris don't care about no jail, man. He's like, Edward was my friend, and I'm going to get to the bottom of this shit. So it's then revealed to the audience that Edward is a little bit fidgety for a corpse, you know what I mean? Inside his tomb, like, the coffin starts rocking back and forth, and then it falls off its little coffin shelf or whatever, and then, like, a sort of grasping hand, like, comes out of the casket, like, trying to open it from the inside. So Edward is like, alive, alive, you know what I mean? So then Boris and I'm just gonna call him Boris, not Dr. Thorne. So Boris and Dr. March, they bring Edward's seemingly dead body back to their little Frankenstein laboratory. And then Boris, he's like, bring out the galvanometer or whatever, the galvanometer. So I was like, I'm gonna shock his ass back to life. So that's what happens. He basically like shocks him. Edward gets up and starts staggering across the floor, and then he tries to talk and then just faints dead away, which, again, pun intended. Now, when he wakes up a little while later, Boris tells him, oh, well, you must have had an attack of catalepsy. And Edward then proceeds to tell Boris that he was completely aware of everything that was going on for the 3 days since he was pronounced dead, like being put in the coffin and the funeral and everything. And Boris says, man, that must have been pretty fucking horrible. And yeah, it must have been. So while all of this is happening, there are also a couple of other characters who are going to factor into the story going forward. One of these is a woman named Victorine. And she is Edward's much younger girlfriend, sorta. He'd very much wanted to marry her, but hadn't yet. Unbeknownst to Edward, however, Victorine has actually been fucking this hot but very penniless young artist whose name is Julian. And the only reason that she tolerates Edward's old ass, obviously, is because she wants his money so she can support her lover's, like, artistic ambitions, right? So these two assholes are super jazzed at the beginning of the story when Edward keels over because Victorine maybe was in the will, I guess. But then when Boris comes over and says, oh no, never mind, like, Edward is actually still alive, she's all like, oh wait, oh, that's awesome. You know what I mean? Isn't that awesome? Yeah. So Boris tells her, well, you should probably marry Edward because didn't you want to? It'll make him happy and he'll get over this whole trauma of being buried alive and all of that other kind of stuff. Although he does tell her, it's like, look, Edward can't overexert himself, or do anything exciting. He basically just needs to lay there and not do anything and not get upset about anything because that catalepsy thing might happen again, right? So at this point, when Boris tells her this, she's practically like rubbing her hands together in like villainous glee, you know what I mean? She's like, oh, of course I'll marry Mr. Moneyback. I mean, Edward, yeah, totally. That's totally what I wanted to. Now, Boris actually does Edward a solid and makes some kind of life alert kind of jewelry like for him. It's kind of like a necklace and a bracelet for each arm that basically tells people don't bury him, like even if he looks dead, right? Boris also tells all the doctors and the morticians like in the immediate area about Edward's condition to prevent him from getting buried alive again. So Edward and Victorine get married. And right after that, Edward shows Victorine like yet another precaution that he's taken to ensure that he never wakes up in a coffin ever again, which, you know, that's pretty understandable. So just like in the original Edgar Allan Poe story, he's had this vault constructed on his property that has just every imaginable failsafe, right? There's like a ventilation system, there's like food and booze in there, there's like this very easily triggered bar that like opens the vault door, there's a coffin that like totally pops open like at the slightest movement. You know, there's like a rope that you pull that like rings this really loud bell like on the outside to like alert people that you're in there. It's like the whole works. Now Victorine is pretty horrified by the morbidity of this place, I guess, but Edward is just like manic, and he's just like begging her, please don't bury me anywhere but in this vault, and he's giving her like explicit instructions of everything she needs to do, like if the unimaginable happens. So Victorine is like pretty weirded out by this, but she, you know, reluctantly agrees to go along with it. Some time passes though. And it seems like Edward and Victorine, like, they've kind of settled into married life, right? Edward seems like so happy and he's so relaxed that Victorine is actually able to persuade her husband to go against the doctor's orders and do some exciting shit. Like, she wants to travel. Let's travel around the world. Let's do all this other stuff. And he's like, anything you want. You've made me so happy, blah, blah, blah. So they take, like, a long vacation. They don't really show any of it or anything like that. It's just kind of, like, through dialogue. And near the end of it, because I think it's 9 weeks long, Edward insists, and it's his idea apparently, that they go hunting, which was a pastime that he used to really enjoy, but like the doctor told him he shouldn't do it anymore because, like I said, it's too much excitement. So they're on this hunting trip, and Edward shoots a deer, you know, shortly after just showering Victorine with praise about how happy she's made him and stuff. And then the poor old man just crumples to the ground, apparently dead. Now, Victorine, after this very... I don't know, kind of a perfunctory attempt to like wake him up. Hey, are you dead? Wake up. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that. Like, obviously she doesn't really want him to wake up. So she takes off all of his little don't bury me jewelry and buries them in the dirt and like puts this big boulder on top of them, right? I mean, she's in a foreign country after all. I think they were in Canada. I can't really remember, but they weren't in the country where they were from. And, you know, the doctors around these parts don't know about Edward's condition. So basically all she has to do is contact the local authorities and get his ass, you know, shoved in the ground just like a regular dead dude. And, you know, no muss, no fuss. So a few weeks later, she returns back home and just falls into her lover Julian's arms. It's like, oh, my husband is finally dead for real. And, you know, we'll soon be swimming in loot, right? Like everything's going the way we planned. Not so fast, though. Dr. Boris is pretty peeved at Victorine for going against her husband's wishes and having him buried on foreign soil rather than in the purpose-built vault that he had, like, you know, taken so much time to, like, show her and everything like that. Like, what if Edward was still alive like he was last time? Like, he would have been able to see and hear everything that was going on, but been unable to do anything about it, which was, like, you know, that, like, would be a fate worse than death, right? Boris also finds it extremely sus that Edward's jewelry was not on his body when they found it, but Victorine tries to excuse this by saying, oh, well, where we were, the villagers are really poor, and they were made of silver, so probably somebody stole them. Boris is not buying this, but he does actually, like, retain his composure. Now, Boris also tells Victorine that you are not going to see a penny of the inheritance until Edward is disinterred in the country that he's buried in and brought back home to be laid to rest in his own vault, because if you'd bothered to read the will, that was a condition that was in the will, that he had to be buried in there before Victorine got the money. Now, Victorine is understandably very put out by this stipulation, but she doesn't really have a lot of choice if she wants to get her hands on all her husband's money, right? So she very reluctantly concedes to have him dug up and shipped back home. So Edward's body is transported back from wherever it was, and it gets put in the vault in this creepy white shroud that he's in. Now, Victorine is already starting to get, like, pretty spooked by this whole situation. And when Julian comes over to see her to celebrate all the money that they're going to be getting soon, she's acting like real skittish, and she keeps like peering out the window at the vault, right? Julian tells her, it's like, look, you're being ridiculous. Like, even if your husband wasn't dead, like when they buried him in whatever country it was they were in, he would sure as fuck be dead now because he'd been under the ground for 6 fucking weeks and no one could survive that, right? Victorine, though, still is not convinced. And it so happens that she was absolutely correct to be anxious about it because just as she's looking out at the vault, the bell on the outside like starts to ring, signaling that someone inside has pulled the rope. Now, Julian dismisses this whole thing. It's like, oh, it's just real windy outside. It was just a gust of wind. But then the door to the vault opens as well, which is a little bit harder to explain away, right? Now, when they go out to check the tomb, the coffin has been sprung open and the body is conspicuously missing. So there's that. Victorine starts fucking losing it. And Julian is starting to get like pretty shaken up as well. Like, where the fuck did the body go, right? And then like both of them go out onto the grounds and very clearly see an old man in a white shroud just like walking around out there. So they run back to the house. Like Victorine is completely terrified, thinking that Edward is either somehow still alive or has returned as a revenant, I guess. But Julian actually suspects some maybe more prosaic shenanigans. He thinks that Dr. Boris dressed up in the shroud like to scare them. However, this theory is shot down in very short order when Dr. Boris himself turns up at the house while the shrouded dude is still standing outside the window, so it's obviously not him. Now, Dr. Boris does seem surprisingly cavalier about this whole situation, like kind of calling after Edward and acting like the whole thing is no big, right? But Victorine is just like not having it. She's just losing her fucking mind. She runs upstairs and is horrified to see Edward's like "don't bury me" necklace like draped across her pillow. And then like the shrouded dude like comes into the room after her and she seems to accept that this is her husband, whether he's still alive or whether he's like a zombie or a revenant or whatever, she doesn't know, but she's starting to freak out, you know? So long story short, Julian finally confesses that yes, Victorine deliberately made Edward go abroad and talked him into engaging in some strenuous activities, knowing that it was likely that he would fall into one of these catatonic spells and be buried alive, and she could, you know, just have him buried somewhere else. Like, once Julian fesses up to this, Dr. Boris actually reveals that the shrouded man is not Edward at all, but it's Dr. March, the attending physician. He's actually wearing a mask that was molded from Edward's death mask, like they made it after he died. So the two doctors cooked up this whole scheme, like very Scooby-Doo-like, in order to get Victorine and Julian to own up to what they had done. This only partially worked, though. I mean, yeah, Julian spilled the beans about the plot and everything. He didn't come up with it, but he went along with it. He knew about it, so he's like an accessory. But by this point, like, Victorine's mind has been completely broken by the sight of her supposed dead husband, like, coming back to get her. So they don't say this, but you're kind of led to assume that she's going to spend the rest of her days in an asylum somewhere. Like, rather than gallivanting about living high on the hog with her little artistic boy toy. So obviously this adaptation, you know, takes a lot of liberties with the source story, which is, you know, most people have read it, but it's essentially just a first-person account of someone being buried alive and then, like, the precautions they take in order to keep it from happening again. But at the beginning of the original story, the narrator does talk about, like, a few other cases of people that have been buried alive, and the screenwriter of this, Douglas Hayes, took those details and, like, wove a narrative around those characters, and I think that was, like, a really good idea. So this was like a real spooky episode. I especially liked the look of the shrouded man in the death mask. It was like pretty creepy. I will say though that other than Boris Karloff, who's fantastic as always, the other main actors came off as a little bit stagey and a little bit like overwrought a bit. I'm not sure if they went overly dramatic with the material because it was a period piece and they thought that would play better, but it was a little bit much, I found. Overall, though, this was it's a very loose retelling of the Poe story. And I will say I actually liked the Roger Corman directed adaptation of Premature Burial that came out about a year after this with Ray Milland. But this one is kind of an enjoyable take on the same story. So episode 4 is called The Weird Tailor. Now, this particular installment is quite significant for being the first story in the Cthulhu mythos that was ever put on television. Although, I will say, like, the connection isn't really all that pronounced other than the mention of a demon named Sathagua, I can't remember like how you pronounce it, which is actually from the works of Clark Ashton Smith, who wrote a lot in the Cthulhu mythos. And there's a plot point involving a Necronomicon type book called De Vermis Mysterious, or like Mysteries of the Worm, and that's from Robert Bloch's Cthulhu mythos stories. So this episode is based on a story by the aforementioned Robert Bloch, who also wrote Psycho, if you didn't know. Now, this episode also like immediately set off alarm bells in my head because the story was so familiar to me. And I assumed it must have been adapted elsewhere, so I looked it up, and lo and behold, I was correct. This was actually also adapted as one of the 4 segments making up the later 1972 British anthology film Asylum, which was made by Amicus, and which I actually like rewatched not too long ago. So that's why I was like so familiar with this story. I was like, I know that I've seen another version of this somewhere, and it's from Asylum, which came out about 10 years after this. Now, in both cases, Robert Bloch adapted his own story for the screen. And although both versions are pretty similar, they do have a few differences. Now, in the thriller version, we first meet this kind of drunk young guy by the name of Arthur. And he goes home to his family mansion to find his father, who I think is only ever referred to as Mr. Smith. His dad is like right in the middle of some occult ritual or something. He's got this big pentagram on the floor and like candles flickering everywhere and shit like that. Now, Arthur just thinks this whole thing is kind of like a lark, in spite of his father telling him, like, this is serious, like, don't get involved. But Arthur's just trying to get to the booze across the room, man. He's, like, not listening. There's the bar over there, and that's what he's just making a beeline. Unfortunately, this takes him right through the center of the pentagram, at which point, like, there's a whole bunch of smoke billowing out, and, like, and Arthur just, like, collapses dead onto the floor. So Mr. Smith is just inconsolable at the death of his son. So he goes to a blind psychic named Madame Roberti to ask her if she can like somehow magic his ass back to life, right? She's actually horrified at this suggestion. Like, she tells Mr. Smith, look, that's some black magic shit and I don't play that. Even though he offers to pay her his entire fortune. And I'm like, well, you know, that's a psychic with some integrity there. She's like, no, I'm not doing that. Now, well, that's mitigated a little bit because he says, well, do you know somebody that does do that black magic shit that can help me? And she very reluctantly, like, hands him a piece of paper with a name on it. So he looks at it and he's like, you gotta be fucking kidding me, right? Like, that's not what he says, but that was the gist of it. She's like, no, I'm as serious as a heart attack. This is who you have to go talk to. So the place that she sent him was this cheesy used car dealership called Honest Abe's. And the person who is supposedly able to penetrate the very veil of death is this very slick cheese dick used car salesman who's called Honest Abe, even though his real name is Nikolai. Now, on the down low, after they have this discussion, Nikolai sells Mr. Smith this very rare occult book called, as I mentioned earlier, De Vermis Mysterious, whatever. Like, Mysteries of the Worm is basically what it's called. Of which only 3 copies are rumored to exist in the world. All the remaining copies, Nikolai says, were burned, quote-unquote, along with their owners. So this is some hardcore black magic reading material, in other words. So Mr. Smith buys it for a cool $1 million, even though Nikolai tells him, look, he's like, look, I can't guarantee that any of the spells in here will work, and even if they do, you know, you might be very sorry that you fooled around with like some dark forces that you don't understand. But Mr. Smith is just like, I'll take my chances, and he pays $1 million and takes the book. Now, the spell that Mr. Smith has to do to bring his son back to life, it entails making a suit out of this weird, unearthly fabric. They don't say where he got it from. He just got it from somewhere. So not only is this fabric supposed to be magical and corpse reviving, I guess, but the person making the suit can only work on it during like certain dates and times, like having to do with like astrological kind of shit. Now, it's here where the titular Weird Tailor comes into play, in the form of this squirrely little fucker by the name of Eric Borg. Now, Borg runs this little tailor shop with his wife, Anna, who he's very, very abusive toward. Now, poor Anna is so lonely and traumatized and shit like that she's actually taken to interacting with this broken clothing mannequin that she calls Hans and talks to as though he's a real person. So it's a little bit heartbreaking, gonna say. So the landlord of the tailor shop, whose name is Mr. Schwenk, He has had enough of Borg's non-payment, because the tailor shop is, like I said, not doing very well. And he's basically threatening to throw Borg and his wife out on their asses unless they can cough up what they owe, like, by the end of the week. Now, Borg is pretty much ready to, like, give it up, and he, slaps his wife around some, presumably to make himself feel better. But then, miraculously, Mr. Smith swans into the shop and offers to pay Borg $500 for a really weird suit that he claims he's having made for his son. Now, Borg can't really make heads or tails of the odd fabric, like he's never seen any fabric like that before, and all these other peculiar stipulations, like you can only work on it like during this hour and that, or like when it's a full moon or whatever. It's that kind of stuff. But the tailor obviously needs money really bad and basically says, well, I'll do anything you ask, like for that kind of dough, right? So he sets to work on it right away. And he also, this is nice, he also suggests to his poor long-suffering wife that when he gets the money for the suit, he's like, oh, I might just like take off and leave you, like leave you in the lurch, like with this fucking shop or whatever. I was like, he's a charmer, that one. So Borg finishes the suit, like right on schedule, and he boxes it up and he's going to take it to deliver it to Mr. Smith. Now, the landlord is supposed to come by and get the money this afternoon, but Mr. Smith said he would pay on delivery, so Borg is not worried. He's like, I'm going to have the money, like, by the time the landlord gets here, and everything's going to be fine. Problem is, when he gets to Mr. Smith's place, it's a little bit shabbier than he was expecting because he thought that this dude was, like, really wealthy, right? Because that's how he was coming across. Now, Smith explains, he's like, well, yeah, I was wealthy, but I paid every penny I had, in order to bring my son back, and too bad, so sad, but it looks like you're not going to get paid for making the suit either, so... Now, obviously, Borg is pretty livid at this, and he actually points to this expensive and clearly new icebox, like refrigerator thing, like in the room. He's like, you must have money. You just bought that. Like, it looks brand new. And then the tailor, like, whips open the icebox door and sees the frozen corpse of Smith's son, Arthur, in there. Like, he's keeping him fresh so he can bring him back to life. So obviously the dude, like, flips out. There's a struggle. And in the, whole brouhaha, Borg ends up stabbing Mr. Smith to death. Now, in this huge panic, he just tries to, like, rid the room of any evidence that he was in there, and then he scoops up the suit and gets the fuck out of Dodge. Now, back home, when he gets back, Anna asks him, hey, did you get the money? Because, like, the landlord is coming by in a minute. But Borg, who's totally shaken up, obviously, tells her what happened. Now, she's completely shocked by this, but she's like, well, you have to call the police. Like, you killed him in self-defense, and there shouldn't be anything to worry about. But Borg's like, yeah, no, we can't do that. Like, the cops won't believe me. And Anna said, well, then I'll call them if you want me to talk to them. It's like, I'll convince them that you were, like, not in the wrong, and he is not having that. Like, so he just fucking loses it and starts beating the crap out of her again, and then he just, like, thrusts the suit box at her. It's like, burn this fucking thing, and he just lurches out of the shop to go get drunk at the nearest bar. So while he's in the bar, like, the landlord comes in there and confronts him about his late payments, like, hey man, where's the money? But Borg is acting so weird that he can't really get any reason out of him, and he's just like, what the fuck is up with this guy? And then Borg just, like, eventually flips out and, like, runs out the bar, because he's obviously guilty about killing Mr. Smith and simultaneously freaking out about Mr. Smith being a murderer and having a frozen dude, like, in a refrigerator, so there's that. And also there's the whole black magic thing, because he does seem to have figured out that that's what the suit was for, and he seems to also believe that it would have worked, or that Mr. Smith believed that it was going to work. Now, because it was implied that the suit would bring the dead son back to life, and because the abused wife, Anna, had a broken mannequin as her only friend and confidant, you can probably guess where the story is going. So while Borg is at the bar, Anna thought about burning the suit, but then decided to put it on old Hans first to see what it looked like, because she was kind of curious. So when the drunk, angry Borg returns home and starts wailing on her again, the mannequin comes to life and kills him, like, off screen. And then the mannequin basically tells Anna, now we can be together. Now, this is implied to not be a good thing, by the way, because obviously Hans was animated by dark magic, and, that kind of thing always comes back to bite you in the ass. Am I speaking from personal experience? Maybe. So this was another great story from Robert Bloch. I think I liked pretty much all of Robert Bloch's work on here. There was some really creepy imagery, especially Hans when he comes to life. Like the actor that played him coming to life was like really good. Like the way he moved, like all inhuman and shit. It was like really creepy. There was some really good acting in this, and some really dark subject matter, like spousal abuse. But they portrayed it really realistically and really sensitively, which was great. I honestly think I like this adaptation a bit better than the one that turned up in Asylum, like, you know, a decade after this. But they're both good. I mean, it's just an inherently solid story, and I think like it translates well to the screen. You know, so it did in both mediums, but I think I like this one a little bit better. So the 5th episode is called God Grant That She Lie Still. Now, even though I usually love old school witch stories, this particular episode, which was directed again by Herschel Doherty from a teleplay by Robert Hardy Andrews, it was actually based on a 1931 short story by a very prolific like English ghost story writer, Lady Cynthia Asquith. But this episode didn't really do much for me. I kind of found my attention wandering a bit as I was watching it. I think the main issue that I had with it was just the amount of exposition that was in it. I think it was like a little bit clunkily presented, and it took like too much time to get through what was essentially like a pretty simple premise, which is like based on a classic witch curse. Like I think they just over-explained it, you know? So the beginning of the story, which is set in 1661, you have like a wildly overacting Sarah Marshall playing a condemned witch named Elspeth Kluwer, who is also a vampire, by the way, because why not? Now, before Elspeth is burned alive, she kind of just laughs contemptuously at all of the assembled people, basically telling them that they will never be able to destroy her. And she then throws out a curse at them. First fire, then death, so it shall always be until my body is returned to me. The weird thing about the mechanics of the curse, though, is that although you would think that she would want to curse like the townspeople who burned her with, you know, I don't know, like crop failure or their kids being deformed or something like that, she basically just places the curse on her own descendants, it seems like. So, I mean, I don't really get that. I don't really get it. I don't get it. But, you know, to be fair, I'm not an all-powerful witch, so maybe she's got some particular endgame in mind that I'm not privy to, but whatever. So then we jump ahead to the present day. And Lady Margaret Kluwer, who is also played by Sarah Marshall, but with blonde hair instead of dark hair, she is returned to her ancestral home a few days before her 21st birthday in order to, like, accept her inheritance, which I'm assuming is the house and the grounds and all that. Right from the beginning, though, there's some shenanigans. Like, her maid, Sarah, thinks that she sees somebody lurking around outside, although Margaret goes out there and doesn't see anything. Just a heads up, too, like before you get too far into this, Margaret has a pair of pet birds in a cage and also a cute little dog named Sheen, none of whom will make it to the end of the episode. Their deaths are not shown, they're just described, but I'm just warning you ahead of time for all those animal lovers out there, because I feel you, I have the same thing. Now, as soon as Margaret is by herself in the room, little ghosty Elspeth like hovers into there and just proceeds to kind of screw with her. She's like laying on her bed and making Margaret like look like she doesn't have a reflection in the mirror, and she repeats the curse that she said on the before she got burned like all those centuries ago. Then she kind of cackles a little bit, and then Margaret passes out because apparently she just can't deal with it. So then the next day they bring in this doctor, Dr. Stone, and he tells Margaret that she has a weak heart and needs to take it easy for a while. There's a lot of weak hearts in this series of episodes. Margaret tells him that she saw her own face outside the window, and it's kind of freaking her out a little bit. Dr. Stone asks her if she's ever talked to a psychiatrist. Margaret gets a little bit mildly offended at this, I guess, as you would. She's like, well, why? Why are you asking me that? But then she kind of rolls with it. She basically like asked Dr. Stone with some amusement, like, hey, why don't you give your professional opinion of what's the matter with me? Now, he's just a GP, so he kind of tries to skate out of it, but he does kind of take a swing at it a little bit. So Margaret's little doggo has disappeared. Uh-oh. See, I told you that was going to happen. And in the course of looking for him, Dr. Stone runs across Elspeth's grave, like in the family plot outside the manor. Now, he gets curious because of this weird inscription that's on her headstone, which is the title of the episode, God Grant That She Lie Still, like spelled like an Old Englishy. And while he's pondering this, this creepy vicar named John Weatherford, I think was his name, he just like pops up out of nowhere. He's like Jason Voorhees, you know what I mean? He's like, pooh, he like teleports into the area. And he just like lays some knowledge down about Elspeth. You know, tell him basically she's both a witch and a vampire, because, you know, it's good to have like more than one gig in this economy, right? You got to diversify. Now, of course, Dr. Stone, being all sciencey and stuff, he doesn't believe any of this supernatural jiggery-pokery. But even he has to admit that Margaret is starting to act mighty strange. For instance, she vanishes out of her room, and then they later find her laying out on Elspeth's grave, like laying there in the rain. She still complains a bunch of like seeing a face, like or seeing her own face, like outside of her window. And at one point, she locks herself in her room and screaming and talking to someone named Elspeth. Wonder who that could be. Meanwhile, the magical appearing vicar keeps magically appearing at random times, trying to convince Dr. Stone that Margaret is maybe in mortal danger. Long and short of it is that Elspeth wants to bring herself back into the land of the living by possessing the body of a direct ancestor. I guess that's kind of what the curse entailed. Now, obviously, Dr. Stone just dismisses this completely outlandish idea, thinking that Margaret probably just needs a shrink. And maybe she does, because not long after this, Margaret's 2 pet birds are found in their cage with their heads torn off, and the dog is found outside with its throat cut. Told you that the animals were doomed. Margaret is discovered in bed with blood all over her mouth and mud on her feet, but she doesn't seem to remember anything that happened. Now, at this stage, the maid, Sarah, decides she's going to bounce, and, I can't really blame her, I find. So Dr. Stone finds a replacement nurse, whose name is Miss Emmons. And the first night that she's there, it appears that Margaret, who seems kind of possessed, wanders over and stabs her. And they just show her stabbing, but they don't show, the stabby, you know what I mean? But then the next morning, Miss Emmons seems completely fine, and it's revealed that Margaret just stabbed her in the arm, which would still be really painful and would probably require stitches, so it's a bit weird how cavalier, the nurse is about the whole thing. And I'm just sitting there, well, I don't know, maybe she's into, extreme body mod or something like that, and getting stabbed is just Monday morning to her, everything, but she's just like, oh yeah, that's a little stabbing between friends, So Dr. Stone eventually brings in a psychiatrist, who's actually played by the ubiquitous character actor, Victor Buono, who's actually been in a few episodes of this, too. And the shrink not only says that Margaret is likely schizophrenic, but also drops the bombshell that the woman's heart condition is way worse than anybody realized, and that Margaret is probably not going to live much longer. Now, Dr. Stone, it's implied that he's kind of developed some romantic feelings toward her, so he's very saddened by this information. But Margaret seems to kind of take the whole thing in stride. She's like, well, it would probably be better for me to die so that I would finally be safe. Now, the damn vicar shows up again. Like I said, he's like Jason Voorhees. He just keeps popping up. And tells Dr. Stone that he's essentially like the Van Helsing to Elspeth's Dracula. So, in other words, his family over the generations has been tasked with ensuring that Elspeth doesn't possess the body of any of her ancestors. And I will say, to their credit, they've actually done a bang-up job so far. So then there's this whole big climax where a very cranky ghost Elspeth sashays into Margaret's room again, demanding to be lodged. She wants the body. And Margaret just screams her head off, and Dr. Stone and the vicar both come running to help her. Now they both of them see the ghost witch vampire being leaving Margaret's body, after which Margaret proudly tells them that she won, and then she dies. Now Dr. Stone is completely heartbroken, but the vicar says, that was the best thing. Margaret was the last of the Kluwer line, and the fact that she died childless means that Elspeth doesn't have anyone else to possess now, because all of her ancestors are dead. So sure enough, when the vicar, tells Dr. Stone to look out the window, he sees Elspeth's grave just smoking, she can't come back. So it's the multi-monster is defeated forever. Now, as I said, I didn't love this episode. It kind of dragged in places and was a little bit repetitive, I felt like. The acting was okay. Sarah Marshall was way over the top as Elspeth, at the beginning. She was normal in the Margaret role, though, so I guess she was just trying to, distinguish the two characters. And I will say that Dr. Stone was kind of a bland character, honestly, and I felt like the episode maybe focused too much on him instead of on all the interesting witch shit that was going on. And even though the whole mechanics of the curse were pretty simple to understand, the vicar just seemed to keep popping up and go on and on about it, and he would just materialize whenever it was convenient to just expound further upon details of stuff that was like pretty easy to figure out. Like we already knew that. We didn't need him to keep repeating it, you know? So it's not great, but still watchable. I mean, I haven't read the original story, you know, I'll note, but so I don't really have an idea how faithful an adaptation this is, but you know, it was okay, but I think this was my least favorite of the 6 that I watched. So episode 6, Masquerade. This one was actually much, much better. This was, again, directed by Herschel Doherty, and it was based on a short story by Henry Kuttner, who's probably best known for his 1936 story, The Graveyard Rats, which has been adapted to the screen a couple times, once in the Trilogy of Terror 2, the anthology movie that came out in 1996, and quite recently in it's kind of like a standalone episode of the Guillermo del Toro Cabinet of Curiosities series that was on Netflix. Now, this story here, Masquerade, it's a lot more comedic than scary, but it's also really, really entertaining and really fast-paced. It's like an old dark house type story, but like with a funny twist ending. And I have to say, like, the really witty back and forth between the 2 leads, who are actually like a pre-Bewitched Elizabeth Montgomery and a pre-Newhart Tom Poston. Just the interplay between them is wonderful. I mean, it just made me bust out laughing like a bunch of times. Like some of the lines in this are just so great and so funny. John Carradine is also in this, and he's a highlight. He's playing this kind of like creepy but kind of wisecracking hillbilly type character, and he's obviously having a fucking blast with this role. So Elizabeth Montgomery and Tom Poston star as a married couple named Charlie and Roz Denham, and they're celebrating their 2nd honeymoon, and they're on their way to some resort or something. Now, along the way, they become lost in a rainstorm. It's very Rocky Horror, but I kind of feel like maybe Rocky Horror get a little bit of an idea from this. So they end up at this kind of like inn, which is, again, played by the iconic Psycho House, which I think this was its 2nd appearance in the series, actually, because I think this was also, was it the Purple Room? It was one of the season 1 episodes. They also used the Psycho House on the Universal backlot, and this one does as well. So yeah, so this inn looks a little bit like it's seen better days, you know what I mean? So once the couple get in there, the Denhams start to joke, sort of, about the denizens of the place, like, eating them, like they're cannibals or whatever. But the proprietor, whose name is Jed Carta, who's, again, played by John Carradine, he cracks, oh, we don't eat the guests, we just kill them and steal their money. And I just busted out laughing. Now, Roz, who is very, very funny, like, this is Elizabeth Montgomery's character, but she obviously uses her very, like, witty, like, acid-tongued humor, like, you know, as a defense mechanism, like, because she's scared or whatever. She isn't entirely sure if the dude is kidding, and honestly, I wasn't either. So she's getting a little bit nervous. Charlie, though, he thinks this whole thing is just a laugh, and he just thinks that Jed and the other hicks in the joint are just getting their jollies by scaring the city folk, right? Jed also happens to mention to them that there have been some suspicious deaths, like, in the area recently, and tells them that there's likely a vampire running around. Now, again, the Denhams just wonder if Jed has a morbid sense of humor and is just fucking with them, you know, because obviously vampires aren't real. It's like, or do these people really believe this? You know what I mean? So as the story goes on, like, every suspicion that Roz has about the danger they're apparently in seems to come to pass. Like, for example, when she tries to leave, like, she finds that they're locked in and, like, the windows are all sealed, like, they can't get out. Both Roz and Charlie both hear, like, this woman's spooky laughter coming from somewhere, and they also overhear a conversation between Jed and his relative, grandson, I can't remember who it was, but his name is Lem, and it sounds like they're planning to slaughter the two of them. So they start searching the house to find out where this weird laughter is coming from, and the Denhams find this old woman named Ruthie, who is played by Dorothea Newman, who I actually immediately recognized from that Roger Corman movie, The Undead, from 1957, which was on, she played, like, the old witch, that was on MST. So I was like, hey, it's her, and I recognized her voice and everything. But yeah, so this old woman is in there, and she's, like, chained to a wall, like, in a dungeon. Now, she tells the couple that she'll show them the way out if they let her go, if they free her. But as soon as they do, she turns the table on them and locks them into her cell, like, just cackling her ass off as she just, like, bye, you know what I mean? It's that. Now, not long after this, Charlie and Roz manage to escape from the cell, and they eventually discover a secret passage which leads down to, like, a cellar. Now, while they're down there, they find this very ominous old guest book that has a list of names in it, along with an inventory of, like, all of the valuables that person had. Now, Roz is like, aha, vindication. She's like, this has to be a record of all of the previous victims that the Carta family, like, stole all their shit and then murdered them, and they're probably all buried down here. But again, like Charlie just thinks this whole thing is like an elaborate prank, right? Now, his opinion of this is not altered when Jed and Lem come downstairs and sort of like chastise the two of them for letting Ruthie out of her cell. It's like she's the vampire, and she's the reason that all the doors and windows in the house are sealed, and that was to keep her from getting out. So the couple obviously don't believe this, and then they retreat to their bedroom. And Charlie takes several tipples from a bottle of very strong moonshine that he found in the cellar. And he just seems completely unconcerned, even after they find this closet, which is full of clothing and IDs and stuff like that from the previous guests whose names were in the book downstairs. So then drunk Charlie just dozes off, much to Roz's consternation. During the night, though, Roz wanders out of the room, almost looking as though like she's in a trance or is sleepwalking or something. And Charlie is a little bit panicked when he wakes up and finds that she's gone. Now, he goes out in the house to find her, and he finds Jed, like, kneeling next to Lem's dead body. Like, from the marks on his neck, it looks like the vampire got him, you know? Now, Jed is freaking out, saying there really wasn't a vampire. We were just kidding about that. But Charlie just kind of, like, brushes him off and goes down into the cellar, even though Jed tells him not to. Now, down in the cellar, Jed is actually confronted with Ruthie, the old lady who was chained to the wall. And she just, like, cackles and draws his big-ass knife on him. And then everything fades to black. Like, you don't really know what happened. In the next scene, he's back upstairs, and he's fine, and he's found Roz. And he implies, he tells her, it's like, well, I had to take care of Ruthie. It was either me or her. You know what I mean? So it's implied that he killed her. Then Roz pulls out, she found the front door keys. She's like, I snuck up on Jed and knocked him out in order to get them. So they use the keys, they get the fuck out of the house, they get in their car, and they peel out. Shortly after this, it appears that they finally arrived at whatever resort they were initially going to. And then the big twist occurs. Turns out that Charlie and Roz were the vampires the entire time. And they settle down for the day in their little shared coffin. After apparently snacking on the entire Carter family. I have to say, this was easily one of my favorite episodes of the series up to this point. As I said, it's not scary, but it's a lot of fun. It's kind of like a real entertaining like spook show ride. Like I said, like an old dark house type of thing, except funny. And the interplay between Elizabeth Montgomery and Tom Poston is so delightful that I'm actually surprised that they never got their own sitcom at some stage. I mean, their chemistry is just amazing. And Elizabeth Montgomery in particular, she just has such a cutting, like, wry sense of humor. It's just really good. Like, they have really good comedic timing with one another. I mean, I was just, like, smiling like an idiot, like, through most of this episode's runtime, because there was just so many great lines that just cracked me up. I mean, I sort of saw the twist coming. I said, well, obviously it's going to be, like... But I didn't know exactly how it was going to turn out. I sort of guessed it's like, well, maybe they're the vampires, you know what I mean? But I wasn't sure if that's how it was going to turn out or not. Honestly, though, knowing that they're vampires now, I kind of want to go back and watch the episode again so I can, like, pick up the clues or whatever. It's because so I can get, like, some more enjoyment out of it. Now, I'm going to say, like, from just, like, a cursory glance through the reviews and stuff of this series, it seems pretty clear that this episode... is one of the most beloved of the whole run, and I'm gonna say it's very easy to see why. Like I said, don't go into it so like horror, but it's not scary, but it is like really entertaining and super funny. Like, and some of the lines in this are just laugh out loud funny. Okay, well that's 6 episodes down in season 2, many more to go. So please keep watching this space for the next half dozen whenever I get around to doing them, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this very long breakdown of these 6 episodes, and I will see you guys again in the salon next time around. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.